Organized criminals have long targeted the weapons stock left over after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. As such, countries across the former Soviet bloc have had a reputation for arms trafficking, bringing us infamous names like Viktor Bout and Leonid Minin. According to the Global Organized Crime Index, Ukraine has the highest levels of arms trafficking in Europe at a score of 9 out of 10. Globally, only Yemen scores higher. Across this part of Eastern Europe, other countries also have high levels of arms trafficking. Moldova was left with an awful lot of ammunition at the end of the Soviet period, and the criminal networks in its Transnistria region have long been involved in arms trafficking. Moldova's score is 7.5 out of 10. Belarus, also with its former Soviet stocks, and in a convenient location between Europe to its west and Russia to its east, has the same score. And finally, Russia itself sits just behind Ukraine with a score of 8.5 out of 10. But what's most interesting is that this number has increased 4 points in just 2 years. In addition to the high levels of arms trafficking across this part of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe has the highest scores for state-embedded actors engaging in criminal conduct compared to the rest of the European continent. In Belarus, the score is 9 out of 10. Ukraine, it's 8 out of 10. The same score in Moldova. In Russia, it is 8.5 out of 10. So you can understand the concern within Western nations, who have sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine for its fight against Russia. The Ukrainian government is aware of this concern and has put in place strict measures to track the delivery of weapons. According to the Ukrainian National Police, those weapons are accounted for and numbered, and that information is then shared with European governments and law enforcement. Russia has insisted that they have evidence that some of these weapons have ended up in the hands of organized criminals around Europe, although so far this appears to be unproven. The GI has recently released a report called Smoke on the Horizon: Trends and Arms Trafficking from the Conflict in Ukraine, which addresses this topic. To discuss this, I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Daniel Brombacher, Director of the Europe Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Daniel, welcome to the Index.
Thank you very much, Finn.
We touched on this topic a little bit in the introduction, but could you briefly explain why arms trafficking is so prevalent in this region?
Arms trafficking used to be very prevalent, especially in Ukraine and neighboring region in the course of the 90s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were massive stockpiles left in several of those countries, including in Ukraine. So there was a flourishing business. And basically, there were two different patterns that you could find, for example, in Ukraine. After 91, that was wholesale trafficking through the port of Odessa in a sort of gray zone between legal and illegal arms trafficking. So Ukrainian weapons and from post-Soviet countries, those arms were rediverted to conflict zones. So basically they were exported based on legal documentation and within a legal framework, but in the destination region, frequently in Africa, in the Middle East, those weapons frequently ended up in the arms of insurgent groups, for example, or of organized crime. At the same time, there has always been small-scale trafficking from Ukraine and neighboring countries to the east, for example, in Ukraine, in the region of Transcarpathia. That is a border region between Ukraine that borders 4 different member states of the European Union. We saw these patterns both on the wholesale level, but also on the smaller scale level throughout the 90s. And these patterns basically stopped with 2014 and the occupation of Crimea by Russia, because then, of course, the demand for weapons within Ukraine rose immediately with the war that has started. So it was a key point where these patterns changed. And we also see very different patterns today in the aftermath of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Thanks for that, Daniel. So it sounds like it was a mixture of geographical location and history that made, arms trafficking so prevalent in this region. But you talked about how things have changed since the Russia's invasion, in 2022. Let's talk about that, right? Because there's been a lot of concerns that, the arms that were sent to Ukraine by Western nations will leak out into illicit markets. Based on research from GI, are there any evidence that this is happening?
Yes, our starting point in 2023 was there were frequent allegations, especially from from Russia, that those weapons delivered to Ukraine will be some sort of kind of like illegal re-import to Europe and will end up in the hands of organized crime in Europe. So we started field research, and both online and offline, into this matter to see if there is any evidence for especially Western weapons making it back to Europe through illegal channels. And the good news is, and we have confirmed that through our report, Smoke on the Horizon, is we have not found any patterns of Western weapons making it back to Europe. There have been isolated reports also within Europe, but every time we checked, we spoke to people, to experts, to law enforcement, and we could never find confirmation for this kind of pattern. So the Western weapons are probably not even the major problem. In Ukraine right now, we don't see any market for Western weapons in the country, and nor any availability outside of the military. Plus, the Western weapons are not even attractive to anyone because it's very hard to get the right ammunition as compared to the Russian-style weapons that are really all over the country right now. All over the country means that there are official estimates that there's something between 1 and 5 million of trophy weapons in the country. Those weapons have been collected on the battlefield, especially when there was a change of the control of certain territory along the front line, either from Ukraine to Russia or the other way around. And those weapons are available and they are all over the country. But the key finding from our report is there's no organized crime involvement in arms trafficking in the country. And there are different reasons for it. The Ukrainian government authorities put a lot of pressure on arms control. For example, we have heard from one soldier saying that you can never put away your gun. You have to take it everywhere. And when you want to demobilize, you can only demobilize when you hand back your gun. So there's a lot of political pressure behind it. And of course, it's a massive political capital for the Ukrainian government to receive weapons from the West. And one precondition is, of course, the government needs to control these weapons and have an understanding all the time where these weapons are. So this refers to the official military weapons of Western production. There's another reason for it beyond the political pressure is, of course, the country is in a very special situation of war. That means there are checkpoints all over the country. So it might be possible and thinkable to travel around with an AK-47 in your trunk or maybe 2 or 3 weapons, but moving around a lorry or a container full of weapons, as in the 90s, for example, is no longer possible. And it's very, very challenging. And finally, there is also very, very little appetite of the civilian population to hand over or to give away guns they have collected on the battlefield. Why? Of course, for self-defense purposes, it is important to have guns. With all the uncertainty of the population, what is going to happen with this war, what are the different scenarios, there's very little willingness actually to sell guns at this stage.
Now, what about, thousands of weapons that were handed out to civilians at the start of Russia's invasion, right? Do we know if there are many that are still unaccounted for?
There are different accounts for these weapons that have been, right after the Russian invasion, have been handed out to people. According to the government, the final destination of those guns and the ownership is registered and is well known. What we have also heard that a lot of these weapons made it actually into the military as well, because when men then are being recruited or voluntarily attend the military, they take their guns already with them. There are also other estimates that believe that something between 20 and 40% of those guns are not well known, but we in terms of sheer numbers, we don't believe there's reason to be concerned about those officially handed over guns, because the big challenge is really not right now, but maybe in a future scenario, the trophy weapons, because there's no registry for them, there's no real account. That's why also the estimate between 1 and 5 million is so wide. Because there's no official sources. But for those weapons that have been handed over by authorities to the population, it's first of all, it's more limited, but there's also a registry behind it. So those weapons are not of a big concern in the country right now.
Right. Now, going back a little bit into the history, right? So during the 90s, we had the Yugoslav wars, which actually produced a lot of weapons. And these weapons are still being used by organized crime today. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why, the Balkans is the go-to place for buying illicit firearms, right? What are your concerns for this particular conflict? What would happen when it ends?
Just to give you an idea, you can still, until today, almost 30 years after the Balkan Wars, you can still purchase an AK-47 in several countries of the Western Balkans for something around $400. I just mentioned before, an AK-47 in Ukraine is $1,000. So it is still more attractive to purchase a gun in the Western Balkans than in Ukraine right now. And it's quite impressive how long the stockpiles have been used to supply illicit weapons to Europe. Our key finding, as I mentioned before, is there is no arms trafficking by organized crime out of Ukraine right now. But of course, we also have asked ourselves, what's going to happen in a potential post-conflict situation? What's going to happen in maybe a prolonged ceasefire situation? And of course, especially those trophy weapons, they're all over the place. They're all over the country. And this may be a situation where we do see trafficking routes being reorganized across Europe. Because since 45 in Europe, we never had a situation with so many weapons available in a country and circulating in a country like in Ukraine right now. So what we try to work on as well is, and where we make policy recommendations, is that the issue of the sheer availability of arms needs to be directed in a certain way to prepare to a potential post-conflict or ceasefire scenario in which those guns may be made available to organized crime at some point. So this is one of the key challenges the country is facing, or will be facing in the future, and that is for sure.
Now, last question, and that's about the arms monitor that the GI has just set up. Can you just tell us what it is, why was it necessary, and what you're hoping to learn from it?
Mm-hmm. In 23, we started, because of these allegations, because of all the rumors around guns in and out of Ukraine, we started the arms monitor for Ukraine. But our research did not only focus on Ukraine, but we also looked at the Western European neighboring countries. We looked, for example, at Sweden, we looked at France, and also as a point of comparison, what I just mentioned, we also looked at the Western Balkans. So what we did see is that patterns of arms trafficking are very much transnational across Europe. So it's really of limited evidence if we only look at one country or one potential route of organized crime and of arms trafficking within Europe. So we have understood that we do need to have a more coherent and more complete understanding of potential arms trafficking patterns across the region. And the key advantage of the GI approach is that we look at prices. So by comparing prices across Europe, we can learn a lot about the supply situation and also the attractiveness of purchasing arms. So for example, we have found out that in France, the same AK-47 that in the Western Balkans may cost $400, a little bit more, a little bit less maybe. In France, it would go away for roughly $4,000. But in Sweden, it would even cost $6,000. So both these countries have currently a growing challenge with organized crime-related violence, and there is demand for it. So these kind of patterns we plan to research and to monitor across all over Europe to have an understanding, and also to be in a position to say, okay, when do we may have a situation in the future that arms coming from Ukraine make it to Western Europe, or also to confirm that this may be not the case. And prices are a key indicator for that. As long as we have a situation as we have it right now, with the Western Balkans still having very cheap supply of guns and Ukraine being way more expensive and more politically constrained, nothing is probably going to change in the bigger picture, but we plan to have a very close eye on that, taking constantly the temperature of arms markets to get the full big picture of Europe and not only to look here and there.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Index, and a special thank you to Daniel for being part of the discussion. Head over to the Global Initiative's website to read the GI-TOC's report, Smoke on the Horizon, Trends in Arms Trafficking from the Conflict in Ukraine. And you can also learn more about criminality and resilience on the Global Organized Crime Index. Just head over to ocindex.net.